Started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don McGrath. I'm from the Institute for Teaching and Learning Innovation, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this session on generative AI and tips. I'd like to start by acknowledging the country on which we gather and recognise the University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianships of the lands on which we meet, and we recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So I feel this is sort of the secret headliner of Ready to Teach Week. And I've been very remiss in some ways in how I've promoted this. I reached out to some colleagues for some support and some guidance around what we should include in this session, and had sent generous offers from Associate Professor Jason Lodge and Associate Professor Sankas Ravi and Dr. Anisha Bakaria. And these are incredibly generous and fantastic people to work with if you had the opportunity, and I have had the opportunity to work with them. They all responded more than just providing some comments with volunteering to come along and talk today. And I thought, this is fantastic, it's 10 minutes each. And then I was reflecting on this last night and I realized I have invited 3 internationally renowned experts in this field who have given many hour-long plus keynotes on how generative AI is working in teaching and learning from a range of different areas, and have asked them to provide their wisdom in under 10 minutes. So I don't know whether this is something where I've been incredibly generous to the audience or incredibly mean to my colleagues, but I'm really excited to see what we get out of today, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So I'm going to indulge myself and hopefully others with sharing a few ideas and updates that I've been excited about in the last few months around how these generative AI tools have been changing. I feel like this area has been moving incredibly quickly, and I go to, I don't know, get excited about some things. Sometimes I find myself feeling a little disconnected from it and a little lost in it, but I thought if I provide a few updates and invite anyone else who'd like to provide updates into chat as we go, and then we'll get into how some of these things are being used with Hassan and Anisha, and then coming back to what research and guidance is happening with Jason, who has been in the midst of what's happening at the national level and the guidance from TEXA, the Tertiary Education Quality Standards Agency, I believe it is, and helping universities work out what we should be doing in this space. And then I think finishing up with a few tips for you for this semester. So what are we talking about today? Really quickly, wanted to highlight the difference between AI and generative AI. So there's a definition on the screen around artificial intelligence. So it's about computer systems to try and mimic and look like they're doing human intelligence things. In the last few years, there's been this explosion of things in generative AI where the AIs are not just sorting things, recommending things, but are actually generating new content in some really interesting, exciting ways. Obviously, ChatGPT came onto the scene many years ago, but in a big way with 3.5 at the end of, what was that, 2022. And you can generate all sorts of things from images to videos to audio to code to text and far more now, playing with 3D models the other day, all sorts of exciting things happening. So on the text generator models, OpenAI has GPT, which is used in the back end of Microsoft Bing, which is what we use here at the university, is provided for you. And I would recommend that as a great default. But there's a whole heap of other models out there that you might want to use and that your students might be using. Google Bard's an incredibly popular one. It's coming up close to ChatGPT in popularity. My experience is that it's not quite as powerful. Anthropic's Claude is out there. It's a really interesting model. I like that it has used a constitutional idea to try and gather data into that system and trying to bake ethics into the creation, not just things afterwards. Elon Musk has had a go with xAI's Grok, which I haven't been able to play with yet, and I don't know if I want to. And then there's a whole heap of fantastic open source models out there, which you can download onto your computer and run. Meta's been behind a few of them with Llama and Mistral, and there's things like Mixtral, all sorts of names out there. If you want to have a play with these, I recommend having a go. If you want to know how they work in any way or dig into doing something exciting with them, I recommend talking to Anisha, who has astounded me with some of the things she's made these things do. I really enjoy generating images. So throughout the slides, there's a range of images that AI generated, and they have a couple of names, my prompts underneath them. So with this explosion of different AI models that generate text, there's been some new features coming through. There's been a lot of integration with media. So the ability to generate images as part of text, related to text, be able to turn text images into text, pull out features of them, and do some interesting things that integrate media together. ChatGPT got an upgrade this year to know up until April 2023. So there's some big changes in what it knew. There used to be people relying on it only knowing up to 2022 to try and protect things or think about it. And that chunk of knowledge changed in a pretty dramatic way. And I think we'll have further upgrades again pretty soon. The integration with the internet keeps getting better and better. So there's opportunity in Bing where it will go and search the internet for very current information, can review web pages for you, do all sorts of things and bring it in. And then there's been some fun happening around things called GPTs and other customized models. So this is where you can take a model and add a little bit on top to make it do something that you want it to do. And I'm just going to quickly share some of those because I love what people have been doing in this space. Okay. So one awesome example is Anisha's Super Project Manager, which I didn't tell her I was going to tell you about. So I put in a prompt earlier trying to say how I'm looking to support academics in a university to explore generative AI. Can you give me some advice to make a project plan for the next 6 months? It said, sure, but you need to give me more information. And this is what it's responded with. So some of these tools can help you plan out projects, add expertise where you might not have them. And this is built on ChatGPT, but then adding that flavor of being an expert in project management. I've added one where I have a disagree bot, and the aim of this one is to disagree with me and add some more flavor to stuff. I talked to some people around this yesterday, so I decided I'd like to show it. So I said that approaches to supporting generative AI in university teaching and learning should be undertaken in partnership with industry, academics, and students. And this is designed to disagree with me and then provide evidence from research as to why I'm wrong. And I use this to try and think more deeply. And it's responded about what the risks are of relying too heavily on industry partners and if direct involvement with students has some risks, how to manage them. You can also do silly things. I like my Monty Python and arguments. So I've asked this one to generate arguments with me. And finally, there's others that can help you provide images. And I asked to create a portrait of a learning designer who can support academics responding to the challenges of generative AI. It's created a prompt for image generation, which has then created this image with all the problems that you'd expect with a generative AI image. So I'm going to go back to my slides after having that quick round of fun. If you want to know about more of these things, please let me know. I'm happy to play. But what I want today is give you a flavor that they're out there and that these things keep changing and keep improving. People have also created some great GPTs to help as Socratic tutors to guide students through specific topics. And it's an interesting place to see that keeps evolving. There's a marketplace. Outside of these text models, people have also been building on them. So they have really lovely APIs, which means that people can use this technology to build other things. There's a range of great things out there that people have built, from guides to writing, guides to going through different areas of research and giving you advice, creating chatbots in different ways. Cogniti's been built at the University of Sydney to help them build on these models and work with their students. There are countless thousands of these things. People were tracking them for a little while. I haven't found a recent tracker. I think the number goes up too quickly. As you may have noticed, I love image generation, partly because it adds some fun, partly because it brings out ideas to the fore. There are lots of options available at UQ. Adobe Firefly is part of the Adobe Creative Suite. That's a lovely thing to use. Bing Chat can generate images. And there's some other more powerful things out there if you get excited by that space. Yeah, I find it interesting. We have some advice from the university about being cautious about some of the dodgier photo style images you can get. I love doing things like an impressionist watercolor painting. I think this feeds more into the strengths of the image generators at the moment. I did some poking around also to see how these things have changed over time. And I found this great example, which I can't claim credit for. but that was looking at how Midjourney, one of these image generation tools, have adapted over the last couple of years. And you can see the huge change in quality from February 2022 to December 2023. We're taking this prompt at the different generations and how much that has changed over the last couple of years. And I think this is a good example of how the power of the different models are changing really quickly. All right. One thing that's becoming very interesting is the ability to clone videos and generate videos. One of the areas that I like is Ethan Mollick's work. He's based over in the US and has a guide for cloning videos. Let's see, that's not going to work. Let's see if I click on the slide. Did I embed this properly? Nope, I don't think I have. So he's developed a really short example for 25 seconds, which I'll show later in this, where he spent less than $10 on subscriptions to create an artificial version of himself, generated a script, put it in, and can generate a video of him reading on a topic he doesn't know about. It's not terribly convincing at the moment. It looks a little animated, but this technology is jumping forward very quickly. There's also a range of other video generation tools like Synesthesia, Vizsla, Runway ML. All of these take a range of different approaches to developing avatars, text to voice, text to images, and join them together in a video for you to use. All right. Ooh. So I'm going to pause there, and I might come back at the end if I have a quick moment to show some more examples. But hopefully that whirlwind tour has gone and raised some ideas of what's out there that could be interesting for you. If you have other ideas that I should be looking at or other options of technologies and so on, please post them in the chat and I would love to have a look. But then I'm going to hand over to Hassan to talk around how he's been implementing some of this in his teaching.
Well, thank you so much. Good afternoon, colleagues, and thanks for joining us today. So I'm going to be talking a little about how we actually take these generative AI models and perhaps what would some of those applications be if you want to add them into already existing tools that we have in education. There are some challenges in terms of using a conversational bot without embedding it into our own technologies, and that's where my passion has been. What would be the benefit if we have a pedagogical mindset in terms of how we bring them to help students, and then we perhaps will have less concerns about whether they will use to cheat. So the platform, many of you would be familiar with, Ripple. There's many opportunities in terms of how we can help students with their learning. They're wanting individual learning pathways, time for personalized feedback, opportunities to build their skills. In large classes, often those are hard to give the students, and various tools and technologies have been used there to help instructors with real-time data on learning, to give them effective feedback, free up some of their time to focus on soft skills. And by all of those, we'll have better student achievements, better engagement, higher satisfaction, and hopefully better retention. The tool that we've been focusing on, next slide, please, Tom, is called Ripple, and we focus on the science of learning and AI in terms of helping students deepen and demonstrate their learning. It's cores around three main learning activities. The first is we partner with students to create content. So we enable them to create bite-sized learning resources. That could be a multiple choice question, a worked example, flashcards, a short video explaining a content. And essentially they will create these and add them to a large repository of resources that could be shared with their colleagues within a course. Given that these resources are being created by students rather than experts, chances are that some of them will be ineffective or incorrect. Therefore, we've wrapped it around a second activity, which is peer feedback and peer moderation, where essentially students will look at the resources that are being created by their peers, and they will evaluate their quality and determine whether they're good to be used in this large repository with the other students in the class, or perhaps they're wrong or ineffective and they need to go back to the author so that they can improve them before they will go into that repository. After these first two activities, we'll go to recommendation, and we'll essentially use this large repository that we've got in order to recommend tailored learning resources to each student. We'll give them questions based on where their strength and knowledge gaps are, harder questions on places where they've demonstrated mastery, and easier questions on topics that they're still developing mastery. Two core principles that we've taken in all of this is that we want the educators to oversee all this learning and be at the forefront of helping students with their learning. And essentially, with teaching at scale, a lot of the problem is that they might not have the right information to do so. So we use various aspects of AI so that students can, instructors can optimally use their time and make sure that that creation, moderation, and recommendation process is happening in a way that it's leading to student learning. Next slide, please. So overall, Ripple is being quite well adopted, and we've scientifically validated various aspects around the platform. To date, it's been used with over 50,000 students, predominantly at UQ, but also nationally and internationally. Controlled experiments we've conducted have demonstrated a 10% improvement in the exams that students have taken. We've seen 70% of students, based on survey response from students, over 700 responses from students, that they think it helps them with the learning. By and large, the resources that have been created by the students have had the sufficient appropriateness and quality to be used within the platform. 90% of the instructors that use it come back, and for large classes where we're relying a lot on peer feedback, it saves instructors a lot of time in terms of if they use it towards their assessments. It is part of the research that I do in my own research lab. So there's been over 30 papers that have looked at various aspects of this content creation and content evaluation by students and how it can contribute to student learning. Next slide, please. So the AI and Gen AI in education, and that's the part we've been thinking about since last year. What does all this mean in terms of how we help students create better content and peer evaluation? So there's been 3 editions of use of AI, Gen AI into Ripple. AI feedback on Create will give students immediate feedback on a resource that they've created to nurture them to become better creators. And based on student feedback, just over 1,000 ratings from students, 75% of the students, 74% have given it a 4 or 5-star rating in terms of helping them create better content. Click, please. The second use case is use of AI feedback on review. This is where students are providing peer feedback to one another. And here we give them real-time feedback so that they'll have a better chance of writing better constructive criticism and better feedback. It's something that many students can get help with. And again, here with just over 4,500 ratings from students, we can see that 75% of them have really thought that it helps them write better peer feedback and peer reviews. And finally, on the third aspect, assume that you're getting 10 students to review one artifact. The meta AI review essentially takes all the reviews that have been done by all the various students, and it writes a meta review, talking to the strengths and weaknesses of the resources and giving sort of the credit back to the reviewers that reviewer 1 said this was awesome, reviewer 3 has mentioned that there's a gap here, sort of summarizing it also that it's easy for students to digest. And again, that is being quite well received by students. Next slide, please. As with everything else, it's important how we tie any tool and technology into learning and assessment. So Ripple is well set up to be used as part of assessment. It is embedded into learning management system, into Blackboard, and it can proactively notify students if there's a pending task that they need to complete. And any grades that you've got on the platform can seamlessly go back to Blackboard if you want to export them back to the Blackboard. There's 3 methods that you can tie Ripple into assessment, and they've all been used somewhat successfully across the university. The recurring assessment is if your course doesn't currently have any existing recurring assessments, then one thing you can do is have a sort of a weekly assessment with students going through cycles of on 1 week they create, then they evaluate, and then they practice. And you can do that with various modules. So module 1, create something, then evaluate something, then do some practice on it. Then you move on to module 2. And this has been quite a successful approach of bringing it into a course if the course currently doesn't have a recurring assessment. The second approach would be if you already have you're sort of at max number of assessments that you already have in your course. And, as per our policy, you can't bring in any more assessments. It can actually be embedded into your existing assignments. So it could be you have an assignment, and part B of the assignment could Could be that you incorporate Ripple into it such that they will need to do a create and a moderation and a practice as part of embedding that into their assignment. And the third option that we've looked at is actually bringing it into a tutorial activity. That there'll be various tutorial activities that actually that session will be dedicated to getting students to think about creating content. And then with the help of actually the tutors during that tutorial and with some prompting, in terms of what's a good way to create content, we actually have those sessions where everybody thinks about how they can create content related to the content that was covered in that week of the course. Next slide, please. I will stop it there. If there is interest, do reach out to us at ripple@uq.edu.au to discuss how it could be embedded. We'll be very happy to sit down with you for an hour to first get a better sense of what your course is like, what your current assessment regime is at, and how we can embed it in. It doesn't take that much time. So for a large class, and that's been one of the principles of how we design it, that we know instructors in academics are busy. So in large classes with 400 to 500 students, we would say that it wouldn't take more than 1 hour of teaching, not necessarily by you, by a tutor perhaps, in order to set it up as well as run it on a day-to-day basis. I'll leave it at that, and thanks, Tom. Over back to you.
Thanks, Hassan. Great to see the work that you're doing with Ripple, and really intriguing to see that data coming through around how students are using generative AI and responding to it. I think it's really promising and exciting work. Anisha, I might jump over to you to talk around how you're using generative AI in your teaching. Anisha, you're on mute.
Hey. All right, sorry for that.
Better.
Okay, thanks for inviting me, Dom. Last year, I swapped from my role as manager of learning analytics within Italy to actually become a full-time academic in the School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. And the first subject that I taught was Comp 2140, which is web mobile programming. One of the things I did in this particular course was actually allow 2 of the larger project-based assignments to use generative AI. And I allowed students to use it in any capacity as long as they just reference their use of it particularly. My reasoning behind this really is that there's sometimes the assumption that generative AI or AI makes everything easier, that it will do a lot of the work for you. And, in some cases, it does produce good output first go around. But especially with programming, and while it can do individual smaller programming tasks, when you start looking at bigger projects, there's a lot more complexity. So whatever you generate has to fit with the bigger project. You're dealing with the requirements, and there's a whole range of things that you need to know to actually use it successfully. And I'm seeing a lot of this currently used in industry. So, on my Twitter feed, I'm seeing a lot of professionals using it in my own professional networks. I'm seeing a lot of programmers actually starting to integrate this into their normal workflow. And so it just becomes something that I think students that graduate are really going to need to know from the get-go. So I embedded, basically allowed students to use the technology. And I would say initially, it was quite a low usage among students. In talking with them, I got the general sense that they were much better at using the generative AI for writing an essay. It was more about what they understood. Even writing emails to me as the course coordinator of the course, I could tell that students were using generative AI. But particularly in code, I'd sometimes have tutors say, okay, a student tried to use this, and then they actually broke their project and didn't know how to fix it. And this to me just really said, we need to be teaching students how to do a little bit of prompt engineering. And my first way of introducing this to students was actually to swap out one of the weekly quizzes and give them a ChatGPT or Google Bard exercise to work on. I made sure that the instructions for what they needed to build was not really detailed, so it wouldn't be able to serve as a prompt. But at the same time, it was actually something a little bit larger than just, do a little code snippet. And so I had this idea of a word search game. Tried this myself in, the freer versions of these tools. And within about 20 minutes, if you prompted it correctly, you could get something working. But in that, I did realize you'd have to be able to take that code and be able to run it, know where the files went, and then also know what functionality you wanted to be able to direct it. And so the results I got back from students sharing their transcripts with me were, they try only one prompt and, try to get some of these systems to do something really large. There's only a certain amount of output that they give you. And so they just get a list of the files and actually just some, comments about what had to go in each of them. And they thought, okay, this is the best that this generative AI is going to be able to do for me, which is not quite correct. Some students got it to generate more of the code, but they did not test it. And then I wasn't seeing a lot of, it's missing this functionality. Can you improve this or do this happening inside of that either? Next slide, please, Dom. So what I actually had to do was spend some time in the lecture to cover some coding prompt engineering techniques with them. At the same time, introducing a governance framework. So, getting them to think about, am I able to use this? And, I use the example of, at the moment, you really have to think about it per assignment. Are you allowed or are you not allowed? And how this would translate if you were working as a professional. Looking at things like, is it suitable? What are the privacy concerns? And, who should be accountable for what comes out of this? And then we went into more technical things like testing your code or debugging your code. And then we actually walked through a number of my own examples. And so I shared chat transcripts with them and we walked through them to actually show them the capabilities and show them how to use some of those prompting techniques for both small examples and larger. Like I did a little Wordle game for them to show them that you can do, full project generation as well as, get more functionality into it. And, just things that they found, particularly the example I showed them of how to, just take your HTML and then get back some components. That was part of the assignment that they were doing, but just something like that actually improves their productivity, and teaching them how to get the best productivity, I think, really takes them forward in their future roles. Next slide, Dom. So this coming semester, so I should say, after I did that, I had a lot more better use of ChatGPT in the projects, and a lot of students were able to successfully complete projects. And this next semester, which I think starts for us next week, I've really been thinking about what we should be teaching. And so part of the research I've done over summer was really looking at what some of the, in the last 2 years, the more technical publications from technical book authors have been coming out. And so I've got this forthcoming paper, which really reviews all of them and looks at the content that they're covering. So obviously there's a lot about the features and limitations of the technology, and particularly how these capabilities are rapidly changing. So, I think we need to not just test our course material or our test questions on one particular version of ChatGPT. In the case of web development, the multimodal models that have come out actually understand images. And so you can do something like draw a mock-up or take an existing picture of a website and ask it to actually give you the code for it. And that definitely affects some of the assessment that we were using. And we would have, if this was tested, beginning of last year, it would not have mattered at all. But the multimodal models now actually can do so much more. But not only things like that, the key things for me from even just looking at what's happening at the moment in coming from book publishers is the two main areas here is that they're actually looking at teaching programming from scratch, but introducing AI coding assistance at the same time. But the techniques that they're teaching students are much more advanced. And so things like learning how to read code and debugging and testing are actually moved to the beginning of the book, essentially. And then there's a lot more looking at the architecture. So how you can look at bigger systems and then actually get Gen AI to actually take this top-down approach with you to then narrow down what you need. And so it's a whole different way of thinking. And finally, the other thing that I'd really be wanting to introduce into my courses is not this idea of people using generative AI, but thinking creatively about what new applications that integrate with Gen AI need to look like. And so the whole creativity and brainstorming that goes into that, so that they're really prepared when they actually graduate to actually be building these next generation of products. So I'll leave that there.
Thanks, Anisha. Intriguing and fascinating, and I don't know, as always, when we hear you talk, my brain's jumping into how can I do this, and the things that we could start playing with in other courses and other places to get people, following these models of, exploring not just programming, but for me, how we get people to think around teaching and learning and how they can design things, how we can get feedback on them, all the other sorts of assessment you can do, and models of sharing prompting with students. So thank you. I'm going to hand over to Jason very soon. And then after I've had given Jason time, I'm going to come back and potentially ask some questions. If you have questions for people that you would like us to push, please put them into chat. And then I'm going to hand over to you, Jason.
Thanks, Dom. So I'm going to come at this from perhaps the very other end of the spectrum and start kind of around the international and national conversation that we're having about where we are with generative AI. Having talked to a few people around the world who are leading this, and I'm thinking particularly of people, some of you might be familiar with some of these names, Rose Luckin from University College London. I think it's fair to say that while some of the research that we've just heard about, some of the stuff that Hassan and Anisha and others are doing, is helping to give us a real sense of where this might go. We've got a long way to go to figure out how that's going to work across, 200 odd higher education institutions in Australia, 9,000 schools in Australia. It's a really complex and difficult challenge. And another thing that strikes me is that if we cast our mind back to where we were this time a year ago, anybody remember that? It seems both a long time ago and not that long ago, all at the same time. We were having a huge panic about students cheating, and it was on the front page of the paper and it was on nightly news bulletins. Here we are a year later, and it's disappeared off the front page. A lot of the discussion, I think, has moved into a different space. Part of that, I think, is a result of the Australian Framework for Generative Artificial Intelligence in Schools. Myself and Associate Professor Christine Slade both had some input into that. So we obviously, given our backgrounds, had an eye on this in terms of what it might mean for higher education. And there's some really important things in there around privacy, transparency, equity. There's not a lot in there about teaching, learning, and assessment. And I think as a result of that, because we're still trying to figure out what this might look like in a day-to-day classroom environment, including all of our own classrooms, it's left this gap where the question has become more about whether or not teachers are going to be replaced by robots. And there's been some fairly startling front page stories in the last couple of months. There's one that always comes to mind for me, which was in the West Australian, where they just had big pictures of robots on the front page and said, "Kids, here's your new teachers." So the conversation, I think, has largely moved away from this as being a problem for cheating to being a broader conversation about what the impact of AI, generative AI, and AI more broadly, as Dom's outlined at the beginning of the session, what it actually means in education. Because one side of it, of course, the acute problem is still there, being that we can't be certain that students aren't using these tools in their assessment because there's no reliable way to detect the use of these tools. But there's also a chronic problem or an ongoing problem in terms of us understanding how these things are impacting on the professions. Again, Dom's touched on this already, but it also means then what are the sorts of things that we need to be doing in our practice within a university to help prepare our students for the world where these tools are now embedded into many, 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 perhaps most, perhaps even all different professions and areas of work. So there are some really complex questions that I think we need to grapple with. We're not alone there. These are questions that people are asking around the world. And thankfully, we have organisations like Grail that Hassan is very heavily involved in, who are looking at the research side of this. And we obviously have places like the OECD, UNESCO, and others who are thinking more about the policy and practice side of things. It's probably fair to say that Australia is among the world leaders in this, at least in the policy and practice side. We don't have a national research centre. I think there is probably broad agreement that we need one for AI in education in particular. And again, a number of us are in conversations about what such a research centre might look like. In the meantime, some of you might be aware there's also a parliamentary inquiry going on. So the federal government is taking this topic very seriously. So it's not a parliamentary inquiry about AI more broadly, it's a parliamentary inquiry specifically about the impact of AI on education. They've been having quite a lot of hearings. Professor Shazia Sadiq was at one of those hearings. I think that was at the beginning of the week. So as an institution, UQ is having some input into some of these processes as well. So that was really to give you a bit of the big picture broadly about what's happening here. I think the good news for us is that we're not alone here, that this is a global problem, and that in the Australian context and for us here at UQ, we're pretty well placed given our contributions to some of these discussions. That also includes the other document that I've got on the screen there, which is the assessment reform for the age of artificial intelligence. Again, there are a number of us who have had some input into that, including Dom, including Hassan, myself, and Christine. And I think that is obviously a regulatory side to all of this. And TEXA has said that they are going to request information from all higher education institutions mid-year this year about what we're doing to adapt to AI, particularly in terms of the risk that it poses to assessment. I think there's also good news in this, given that the regulator has said that they're getting involved in this. They're going to ask us what we're planning on doing and what we have done. It means that institutions around the country, universities and other higher education providers are really collaborating in a way that we haven't seen for a little while to figure out how we might do this together. So there was a forum hosted in Sydney on Tuesday where there were representatives from many universities around the country talking about how we're adapting to generative AI, what these principles that we've outlined in this TEXA document might mean, and how we might come up with a credible action plan for how we might move forward with this. So again, we have a problem here. It does pose a bit of a risk to what we're doing. However, there is also good news in that I think that there is a lot of goodwill around the country, across the various universities in terms of us helping each other to figure out how we might do that. What this will mean for us as individuals, as a course coordinator myself, is that we can hopefully look forward to some resources that will make the process of adapting what we're doing to AI as straightforward as they can be. Right? Like it is a complex problem, but I think that putting our heads together across the country will probably come up with some good resources to help us to adapt to this new reality that we find ourselves in. Next slide, please, Dom. The other part of this, I think, around the teaching and learning side, and again, Hassan and Anisha have done a good job in talking about this as well. We are learning a lot more broadly about how these kinds of tools are integrated into learning. So we've also collected some data in my group. We've done a lot of interviews with students across different disciplines to try and understand how they're slotting this new tool into their learning. Now, to be fair, there are a proportion of students, and it was about half. Right, it's hard. I mean, we've had interviews with 50 students. It's not a massive survey of thousands of them, but about half of the students that we spoke to are quite reluctant to go anywhere near generative AI because they're kind of terrified of being in trouble for it, which is understandable given that there have been some messages going around about inappropriate use of this tool and that it could be a form of cheating and so on. But when we talk to students who are using these tools, many of them are coming up with quite sophisticated ways of integrating these into the way that they're learning. It's certainly not a situation where students are taking an assessment task, plugging it into ChatGPT, getting an output and submitting that as their assessment. There is a much more sophisticated set of learning practices emerging that include things like students using this to brainstorm or as a way to help motivate or coach them through something. and it's much more complex than, for example, we hear the argument that these tools are just like calculators. A calculator is a sort of transactional relationship. Give the calculator something to calculate, it gives you a response, we do something with that response. This is much more of a kind of relational thing, right? Chat GPT, it's about chat. It's an interaction, and it's students are already figuring out really sophisticated ways to use that interaction to help their learning. The picture here I wanted to show you is that that is also one part of a much broader set of resources and co-regulatory components that contribute to the way that students navigate their learning. They're still relying on some of the classic internet, tools that we've had for a long time, right? So they're Googling stuff. They might, for example, get a fairly fluent response to something from a generative AI tool if they're stuck on something or want to, learn about a particular concept. Many of them know they can't trust that, so they'll then Google it. If they still want more detail, some of them will go and watch a video, for example, and then at various points along that journey, they might interact with some of their peers, either in a small group or a large group. So lots of options that they've got around them, and many of the students who, have quite a good understanding of their own learning are doing a great job at figuring out how to integrate these new tools into that learning. So not only is the technology advancing, but we're also seeing that the way that students are using these tools is advancing. And like I said, there's some sophisticated ways that they're integrating this into how they learn and how they approach their assessment. So as we develop a better understanding of that, I think we'll be better placed to think about how we might continue to adapt what we're doing in response. So that's kind of the sense of what I'm seeing out there. I hope that was helpful, and back to you, Dom.
Thanks, Jason. Really appreciate it. I think that connection to what's happening across the sector and nationally and internationally is really helpful to see where this is moving and where the guidance and requests are going to take us. I'm just going to respond. Anari, as you're talking, put in a comment around integrity issues, and that's definitely one part of those TEXA frameworks and the work that we've been doing around ensuring the integrity and security of our assessment, both that it's secure as well as that we're appropriately assessing students for the future, incorporating generative AI. And then as you hinted at that, the schools framework, I think, goes into more depth around some of the other concerns that Anari's hinted at around the security of the information that we're putting into these systems and the privacy, those sort of considerations. I'm not going to touch on them other than say that at the moment. If you would like to catch up with me or anyone else in Italy, we'll be able to provide some support and guidance around some of those integrity considerations, as well as how do you implement these things. I wanted to wrap up with a few tips and guidance. If you have others, please feel free to throw them into chat. This space keeps changing. It's the best advice that I've got. It is different at irregular intervals. It feels like there's some weeks where there's not a lot of change, and then another week where there is an avalanche of change that changes what's available, what data is, and how things work. I recommend that if you're thinking about assessment and you're trying to rely on a current limitation of AI to say this is going to be safe for this semester, it's a really risky option. We've seen throughout other semesters that the systems have changed, new systems come on, and that weakness has been fixed or removed or become more problematic for you. The better news is that what makes good assessment hasn't changed too dramatically. The principles for designing really effective assessment are still the basis for designing really effective assessment. And I'd really recommend reading the paper that Jason mentioned he was a contributor to. He was a contributor as lead author. I have a look. The guidance in there around how to make assessment work in this space, I think, is very solid and very applicable. Some moments are around thinking about more programmatically and connecting things up in ways that you might not be able to do on your own, but connecting it with other people to make things work is a really great option. Then my last big tip is try and use these tools in your own work. The only way I've been able to keep up or try and get my head around what's happening is to make a conscious effort to see what it can do for me, to see whether it can analyze a web page, whether it can generate an image that might be silly, or might be fun, or it might be very serious, to try things in my work where I'm going, this is going to be annoying. Let's throw it to ChatGPT. I don't know how to plan this process out. Try things happening and see what it can do. Anisha's also throwing some hints around some of the other fun things that are happening. Running things on a Raspberry Pi model. If you don't know what a Raspberry Pi is, it's a tiny little computer that's very cheap, very small, and having a model like this run on a Raspberry Pi is pretty much similar to the ability of being able to run these things on phones without the internet and things like that. So that this area keeps changing in dramatic ways. The other thing that I want to highlight is that there is support available for your students. So Ask Us in the library are doing incredible things. They have workshops, they have modules, they have other guidance for students to help them work out how to engage ethically and effectively in this space. So while I truly love what Anisha's doing, and if you'd like to do something like that, keen to help. If you don't want to go to that level and you want to have some guidance for students around how to use some of these things, I recommend those workshops and guidance available from the library. And if your students are struggling in any way with the processes of putting together their assessment and working through student services, has some awesome student support to guide students to be able to engage effectively in their studies. Okay, and finally, this is the first step of our digital learning community of practice for this year. So throughout the year, we're planning to get a couple of sessions together where we bring people together to talk more deeply around generative AI, but also other aspects of digital teaching and learning. If you would like to be involved in helping us prepare these sessions, thinking about what should happen and how it should happen, please let Hassan or I know. We'd be very keen to talk to you and bring together a group to plan out what we'll do this year. We also have a series of What's Working webinars. We're very similar today. We bring together people who are doing interesting things across the university and ask them to share their experiences of both what is working and what they find isn't working. So again, if you know someone who should be involved in one of those, please let me know. The last thing I want to finish up with is that I have a really quick evaluation poll, which I've hopefully launched. If you can give us some feedback on today's session, I'd really appreciate it. We'll be sharing the resources from today, as well as the recording on our website next week. And if you have any further questions for anyone on the panel today, please let us know. We'd love to hear from you and really appreciate your time today. And I'll also say one more thank you to Hassan, Anisha, and Jason. Really appreciate your insights and time and willingness to share.